Fountainhead Forum 11, I have Emily Goldberg, who is the current chair of the Libertarian Party in the state of Arizona in the USA. She's a longtime activist, and we're going to talk about Marc Victor's Senate race as well as some other things. How are you, Emily?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks for reaching out to me.
Okay, so first of all, how did you get started with the LP, and what got you into the Libertarian Party and the movement?
Oh wow. Well, I'm trite as it might be to say it, I was probably one of those people who was already always a libertarian but didn't know it. I had worked in the 80s on Native sovereignty issues. I had worked on peace and anti-war issues from the time I was a teenager. I was very much aware that I was fiscally conservative and opposed to the welfare state myself, but interested in, I guess, the kinds of issues that were often associated more with the left, like Native sovereignty and like, ending wars of foreign aggression and so forth. And so I was an independent for 22 years before I found the LP. I think that part of what motivated me ultimately was running into FDA hurdles when my parents were terminally ill. The one drug that was effective for the disease that my father had was an Italian drug that wasn't FDA approved. And the American drug formula or cocktail that was available was something that was already 20 years old at that point and had a 13% effectiveness rate. And I needed to jump through a variety of hoops to get my dad on the drug that would be effective for him. And that involved NIH hoops and FDA hoops and regional clinical trial administrator hoops. And ultimately, my family imported the drug through a compassionate use provision, which is what existed before Right to Try, and it cost us a phenomenal amount of money monthly. And whatever faith I had left in government at that point died in those years. The long and the short is that he was diagnosed with 3 months to live, and getting him on the proper drug, he lived for 16. And his doctor that I had printed out all of the literature about the drug that I wanted him on from Italian journals and French journals and Swiss journals and other things, and had gone to the doctor, with 3 notebooks full of stuff. And the doctor had said, I don't need to read that. They didn't present anything about that when I went on my last continuing ed conference. Well, after, this confrontation with him and getting him on the proper drug, the doctor eventually came back to me at like the 9th or 10th month when my dad was not only still alive, but still working full time, and said, he's so far ahead of the curve. He's off the charts. I'm like, gee, you think? So that was really what made me a libertarian.
So did you do the French and Italian translations yourself?
No, I didn't translate. I could sort of read enough that, the numbers were the important thing, and so I could pick out enough of it that I knew what I was dealing with was valid.
Oh, so. That's what's just interesting. I wondered, I wondered if they were, obviously they were still published in French and Italian. So, which of course, those two languages are pretty close to each other, but so that's it's often something like that, though, when you have a crisis that just makes people go over the edge, and you said he was given 3 months to live, and you said he lived for 60 months. Is that correct? Or
16
16 months. Okay.
Yeah. He had invasive stomach cancer.
Oh, okay. So that's certainly a scary experience. So yeah, so that's when you and so you've had several offices, and now you're the chair of the LP,
Right.
the
Um,
state LP.
yeah, I got involved originally more or less as a volunteer, and there was cross pollination for a lot of years between both the AZLP and the Arizona Green Party and Fair Vote Arizona. And I was also an officer in Fair Vote Arizona, which was the state chapter of Fair Vote USA, which was a major election integrity association and advocate of ranked choice voting. So Fair Vote Arizona had put forth a ranked choice voting referendum in the city I live in. I was involved in that campaign. I was the communications director, among other things. But I got involved in the LP in 2005, originally as a volunteer and then as sort of an events planner. And at the first convention I planned, I was nominated as assistant secretary, and that was 2009. And I've been on the board consistently, with the exception of 2 years since then. So yeah, a number of roles.
Okay, so yeah, so you've been very active. Just how many hours a week or a month does a state chair usually put in?
I can't tell you what usual means.
Yeah,
A lot of months in the past couple of years, 70 does not get it done.
70 per month.
Yeah. And I think there have been, I think I have worked under 5 state chairs, and, some terms have been busier and some terms have been quieter. And to some extent, that has depended a lot on what's going on, both the inward facing and the outward facing responsibilities. Some years there has been a lot going on internally, less going on outside. These couple of years, especially since COVID and since Arizona has become sort of ground zero in the duopoly wars and the election integrity discussion and other things, there's been a lot to show up for and a lot to do. and it's demanding. It's demanding.
Do you think the duopoly is working harder against the LP in battleground states like Arizona?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I know that the RNC vowed in 2012, and we learned this via their House Speaker at the time, to get those something bleepity bleep libertarians off the ballot in Arizona. And they have enacted 2 legislative initiatives which have radically increased our signature requirements, so that getting candidates on the ballot is 8 to 1,000 to more than that times harder than it was 10 years ago. There are offices that used to take 70 signatures. Some of those now take close to 4,000. So yeah, they're making it as difficult as they can make it. There are also efforts underway in Arizona, and I imagine other battleground states, to limit the size of the electorate, to purge the voter rolls, to do other things that work at disenfranchising registered voters. I can also tell you that I have seen some of my downline officers not just hassled, but aggressively hazed. For example, post-COVID, we had a series of conflicting instructions from county recorders and from the legislature on how precinct committeemen, which are our local party officers, were to be nominated and elected this year. And because those instructions were in conflict with each other, there needed to be an attorney general's opinion and then a new instruction from the legislature repealing its previous instruction, and so forth and so on. One of my guys in one of the more rural counties took the paperwork he was supposed to file with the county recorder to the county recorder's office. She refused to take it. He was not, vulgar or violent or anything else. He, was assertive. But she not only chased him out of her office, she sent 2 police SUVs to watch his house for the next few days. And when I learned this, I wrote a really angry letter to the county attorneys in that county. And I said, just explain to me why it is that you've instructed the county recorder not to do her job. Because I'm evaluating, what my due process options are for, my downline officers. And I need to understand why you're doing this. And interestingly enough, the next morning at 10 in the morning, the county recorder is on the phone to me with all kinds of apologies, ruffles and flourishes. And, oh, it's been such a terrible misunderstanding. And, if you'll send your officer back to us, we'll take his paperwork now. And, but like police SUVs, this is the United States, this is not Indonesia or Myanmar or Nigeria, or do you understand? And like, it's just mind blowing. So yeah, they're making it hard. They're making it as hard as they can make it.
And so the last time Arizona LP had a statewide candidate running for any statewide office was when?
16, I think.
2016, and I assume that was either governor or senator.
Yeah, we had a candidate for governor who. So another thing that the duopoly does is that when we have candidates on the ballot, and this is something that should have raised a red flag in my eyes concerning the Victor candidacy, and it didn't. They sue to get our candidates off the ballot. And sometimes they have a reasonable basis for suing, and sometimes they make up stuff. But in that race in 2016, they sued alleging that our governor candidate's signatures were not all proper signatures. And he did not have the wherewithal to mount a formidable defense. So Marc Victor, interestingly enough, neither of the duopoly parties sued to get him off the ballot. And that's what I'm saying should have raised red flags to me. And I was just so relieved that we had a candidate on the ballot and that I had something to show our 40,000 voters, that I didn't stop to say, wait a minute, why isn't he getting sued? Our legislative candidates got sued. So I should have seen that, and it should have triggered something, but, I guess I'm capable of sort of being lulled into complacency too.
Yeah. And he had to, and it looks like he announced he was running December last year or something like that. But,
he did.
He
did. And he began gathering signatures at our January. So by statute, we need to hold our convention and annual meeting in January each year. And our bylaws prescribe which city we need to hold it in. And We hold even year meetings in the city of Tucson and odd year meetings in the city of Phoenix. And we held our Tucson meeting last winter, and in January he was it seemed very much up and running. So yeah, there wasn't a question of delay or a late announcement or an unconvinced decision or something else. He seemed excited and motivated and committed, and we didn't at the time see any reason that we shouldn't be excited, motivated, and committed with him.
So yeah, Texas has it that way too. They fixed the date that the state convention has to take place.
Right.
No love for Flagstaff, I guess. But
anyway. Well, it's so some of that decision in the bylaws sort of relates to factions that existed in the state party in the 90s and sort of who the major players were. I would like to see us move towards a model where other counties can bid to host our annual meeting. And I'd like to see some of the more emerging counties offer to do that. I think that could be a reality in the next couple of years. But we would need to make some adjustments to our bylaws to make it possible.
Okay. Well, anyway, so Marc Victor jumped into the Senate race, and he he apparently went and gathered the signatures all by himself. Is that what I've heard?
So in general, our candidates really do need to manage their own campaigns. We can provide them with information, but we have no paid staff like most states. We're an all-volunteer organization in terms of, our state committee, which is essentially our statewide governing body. We're about 20 people. Our board is about 8 people. But we're accountable to 40,000 registered voters. So those who are sort of part of the spine of the party tend to wear many hats and tend to be spread very thin. It's not perfect, but candidates essentially need to run their own campaigns. We can certainly give them advice. We can share the resources that we have. In terms of information, in terms of, voter lists, in terms of walking lists, in terms of volunteers, but the where to go to collect signatures and when to do it and what your speaking script is and that kind of thing, that's pretty much up to the candidate. We do understand that he used some volunteers and some paid signature gatherers, and certainly other candidates in the past have used both volunteers and on occasion paid signature gatherers as well. So both of those things are a thing for us on the ground here.
Yeah. And you told me it was 3,750 to get on to run for Senate. So
it may be a couple more. It may be 768, something like that. But it's a little bit. Yeah. It's a hair less than 4,000. Yeah.
Yeah, and usually you have to get about twice as many signatures to ensure you have good signatures.
We usually are telling people to shoot for about a third more. I don't know that, a third more seems to be our safe zone when we were part of the coalition to refer the first signature increase bill to the ballot, which would have overturned it. In that era, we needed 88,000 signatures to refer something to the ballot. We got 110. So 20% more to a third more, I think is kind of our safe zone. when we're working with trustworthy people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, sometimes, people they just sign something without thinking about it. Although,
So part of the reason that we have had mixed feelings about paid signature gatherers is that we did have an experience in around 2012 concerning a paid signature gatherer who was just making stuff up, and learned that we had to validate every signature before we turned it in. And so having it up close and personal with that. The important thing is to work with people who, we have some sense of their bona fides in being able to accomplish what they say they're going to accomplish. So.
Who have a record, because I think you usually pay those people like $1 or $2 per signature or something like that. I don't know what the going rate is.
Yeah, and so 10 years ago it was 3-ish or a little more, and I think it's more than that now.
Okay, I wasn't. I knew they usually got paid by the signature though with it.
Right.
So, yeah. So
I'm sure it varies, market to market. I'm essentially talking about in Arizona, but. Yeah.
I also assume there's a filing fee to run for Senate as well.
I'm not going to tell you I know what the filing fee is off the top of my head. I probably should, but I don't. Yeah. There are disclosures that candidates need to provide to the Secretary of State concerning their campaign asset picture and other things like that. So there are both information hurdles and some financial gatekeeping as well, I guess you'd say.
Yes. Yeah. They usually have to tell something. Usually have to give away a lot of information just to run for office. Like
you do.
So Marc Victor went through a pretty significant undertaking just to run for the Senate, is what you're telling me, though.
Yes. I mean, anybody who runs for a nationwide office is engaged in a significant undertaking, and coming out of sort of the environment since the lockdowns, once upon a time, our candidates used to be invited to all kinds of community forums, everything from city and town chamber of commerce to retiree groups to business interest groups to whatever. We've seen a lot less of that since the pandemic, but a couple of the TV stations still hosted debates, and he did appear in one televised debate. So I can tell you that in some prior years, for example, campaigns that I worked on in 2010 and 2014, after primary season, anybody working on a campaign, your candidate would be appearing somewhere 4 times a week, and so that has changed a lot since the pandemic. But it is what it is, I think.
So it sounds like, at least in Arizona, the media is treating the LP even worse now, or?
Oh my goodness. I wish I knew what to say to that. I'm not going to say that there's one universal media. There really isn't. And it really depends on whether you're talking about, national affiliates, whether you're talking about local newspapers, whether you're talking about student publications, whether you're talking about podcasts or, Instagram channels or other things run by LP associated people or by friendly people. And again, we also in Arizona have a very large independent voter bloc. And while I would say the duopoly has us and had the Green Party in their crosshairs, the media is kind of trying to cuddle the independents. And we have a pretty reliable complement of independents who routinely vote with us. I believe that some of them probably like our platform and like our values and vote with us because we reflect a lot of their outlooks. I think some of them probably vote with us because we're the closest thing they can come to a protest vote. And, I like both of those things. But so worse, yeah, I would say some media is making it worse, certainly. But I'm not sure how much of a new trend that is. And I'll give you an example. In 2010, David Nolan, our founder, was a Senate candidate running against John McCain. And I think it was Rodney Glassman was the Democratic candidate. And anybody watching that debate online, 76% of them felt like David was the winner. David confronted McCain pretty intensively about McCain's support for the NDAA and surveillance on Americans and the wars of foreign aggression and so forth. He really didn't get into the weeds of marijuana policy. But the next morning in the Republic, which is our statewide largest AP associated newspaper, the next morning in the Republic, the coverage was, well, Libertarian candidate and founder David Nolan spoke about legalization of marijuana. It's like, really? Yes. I was there in the studio with David and Elizabeth. Are you serious? I was there, So I don't know what to say. That the media sort of is self-perpetuating and perpetuates its own images. Yeah, I think anybody in politics knows that.
Yes.
Are we getting something significantly worse from the mainstream media than what we were getting 10 years ago? I'm not sure. Is there a lot more noise from, say, the new media when, there's something that appears to be controversial or a misstep? Oh yeah.
Yeah, and of course I know David Nolan unfortunately left us pretty soon after that race.
10 weeks afterwards. Yeah.
I'm glad I got to meet him at Freedom Fest that year, and he's still a friend on Facebook because his Facebook is still there. But that was David Nolan's last hurrah. So I'm glad he went out. Sounds like he went out in a good way though, but with that race. But yeah, we'll see. So
he was very prescient though. He said that night after that debate, he said, "I know this is my last campaign."
Wow.
So yeah.
Yeah, wow, that's wild. But yeah, so we're getting back to Marc Victor's Senate race. So he raced and started campaigning. He obviously had probably had some volunteers working with him.
He did.
Yeah.
And he had some of, so he's an attorney, as you probably know, and he's got a decent size, mid-sized law firm. I think some of his law firm staff were also volunteering time on his campaign.
Yeah.
So.
And Marc is, I want to stress too, Marc has fought a lot of good fights. I mean, I believe he sued Hawaii,
right,
because he's also licensed in Hawaii apparently, and he sued to get rid of some of their Corona mandates. I mean, I'm at National Conference.
He's definitely, been in for the long haul and fought the good fight, and has been associated with the party over 30 years. Which is, I think part of why some of us were so personally anguished over the decision that he made to endorse someone not only in the duopoly, but in the duopoly party that has committed itself to getting libertarians off the ballot.
Yes.
And, it really, I mean, I think you mentioned that you had read the discussion I had with Brian Doherty in Reason. And that's what made it feel like a punch to the gut, is that, he knows in a way that a lot of people don't, what kind of steep climb we've had to maintain ballot access in this environment, and what it means to our, 40,000 people have put their trust in this party, enough trust that they want themselves labeled with our label, with our banner, and they want to show up and vote for our candidates. And
so Marc, and as you pointed out, Marc dropped out on he announced he was dropping out of the race on the 1st of November, and then endorses Blake Masters.
Right.
Of course, by then, early voting had started, and all of the ballots were essentially etched in stone anyway.
I won't say all. So we have what is known as the PVOL, or the Permanent Early Voting List, and that's essentially a voting by mail choice that a voter can exercise. A significant majority of Arizonans do use it. I myself don't. There are a lot of Arizonans who do vote same day. And so I would not say that ballots were etched in stone. The early ballots had been mailed, and early ballots can be postal mailed back to their recorders, postmarked by the date of the election, or they can be dropped off in person to voting places. And so people who are on the early voting list, sort of have their ballot in hand really for as long as they want to keep it. They can send it back the same day they receive it, which is 3 weeks before the election, or they can hang on to it till 6:55 p.m. on election day and drop it in the box right as the clock hits 7 and still be under the wire. And so yes, the ballots, the early ballots had gone out, but I wouldn't say written in stone.
Well, I mean, you can't but he couldn't at that point. He was really beyond the point where you can realistically drop out.
Yeah, so he had sort of thrown down the gauntlet to anybody else running, to asking them to convince him why they would be superior to him as a candidate carrying the interests of freedom and his live and let live nonprofit organization moniker.
Yeah.
And I don't have a sense at the moment of whether the GOP had always intended to try to incentivize him to drop out, whether he had pre-agreed with them that that is what he was going to do, or whether they saw that their numbers were suffering and thought they'd, grab at any resource they could grab at. I don't know those things. I don't know those things. I do know that there were a couple of statements made that generated some negative publicity for him. I know that I scrambled some people in the AZLP and in MCLP to get out ahead of those statements and to publicize more broadly positive endorsements of him. Also had asked National for something similar. National managed to generate that on the 31st, and then he drops out the morning of the 1st. Don't think that there were not, staff people from National very much not happy with the AZLP when that happened.
Yeah.
We went to the mat for you, and this is what you do, was sort of what got looked at me. And I found myself personally in the position of having to say, over my dead body, not on my watch, not with my knowledge, but that got very embarrassing. And that, that kind of political maneuvering throws your friends under the bus.
Yeah.
Even if you feel for yourself like you've made the personal right decision.
Yeah.
Never mind me, because I don't matter. But our 40,000 voters, who entrusted him to carry forth their interests and their interest in our continuing ballot status and their interest and pride in being Arizona libertarians, and the other 30,000 or so who vote with us, whether they're sort of libertarians, but they like to vote in the primaries and so remain independent because independents can pick up a major party ballot to vote in the primaries. And we don't hold a primary because we don't feel like the taxpayers ought to be responsible to pay for us to choose our candidates, so.
Yeah. And so do we know, did he consult with he didn't consult with you or anybody in the Arizona LP. Did he consult with his volunteers? Did he consult with any of his donors? He had this talk with Blake Masters, but when Marc Victor dropped, did he talk to anybody about, hey, I'm thinking about dropping out now. Do you think I should drop out? Or was this a decision he really basically made on his own? Or do we really know this?
I certainly do not know. I don't know who he spoke to. My guess is that probably Masters' handlers or campaign staff probably contacted his campaign staff. I don't know at what level the AZGOP or the RNC either encouraged Masters or incentivized Marc. I really don't know. He certainly didn't share any of that thought process or decision making with me or with anybody else within the AZLP who was working with or for him. He certainly didn't share it with National. And I imagine that who he spoke to were people who wanted to see him do that. So probably Liberty Caucus Republicans, probably people on Masters' campaign team, maybe people in the RNC, maybe people on the AZ GOP board, and I don't know.
Yeah, we don't know. That's and we and the only people we know who made public statements were, unfortunately, Dave Smith, who and of course the Ron Paul Liberty
New York, and who does not have a whole lot of understanding of the uphill battle we fought for 10 years now concerning ballot status. And I would share that with anybody. The thumbnail sketch is that there was one round of bills in 2013. It was styled HB 2305, which was going to increase our signature requirements threefold-ish, increase the Democrats 1.5 times, prevent certain kinds of ballot bundling in churches and union halls and other things. We didn't like it, the Democrats didn't like it, and the Greens didn't like it, and we all formed a coalition to refer that bill to the ballot. If the voters voted on it, it would have the strength of a constitutional amendment in Arizona. So when the Republicans saw that we had gotten the signatures necessary to refer 2305 to the ballot, they repealed it of their own accord. And our legislature only sits 4 months of the year. In the off season, the Democrats and the Republicans coalition with each other to determine what they could live with. The Republicans threw the Democrats some bones in terms of the bundling issues and other things. And what came about next was HB 2608 in the 2014 legislative session. And that's the bill that enacted the vast increase on us of about 8 times to 1,000 times, depending on the office. And we have, part of the issue there is that there are not enough libertarians for us to meet those signature requirements. And we have the benefit of previous Ninth Circuit decisions respecting our constitutional right to freedom of association and allowing us to keep our primary closed if we were to have a primary. So we sued, citing that decision, saying, wait a minute, we've got a political party's right of freedom of association here, but you're making us gather signatures from independents and from people of non-ballot status parties like the Constitution Party and so on to get our candidates on the ballot. Can't do that. Well, so we lost in federal court in Arizona. We appealed to the Ninth Circuit. The state came back arguing the inherent state interest in a stable two-party system. No, I couldn't make it up if I tried. But that stable two-party system argument is the same argument that the state used when it took our name and the Green Party's name off of the voter registration form. So, when you want to talk about the duopoly and how aggressive they're being, erase us from the voter registration form. I mean,
yeah. And so this and so it looks like really it doesn't really look like Marc Victor helped Blake Masters at all in the grand scheme of things, because Blake Masters ended up losing anyway.
I have no idea. I don't know. I think here's the sad piece, okay, is that Masters is a very aggressive border hawk. And I'm not imagining that most voters who would want to vote for a Libertarian would be oriented to voting for someone with the kinds of goals for his potential run that Masters articulated anyway. You know, I think it's very old school conventional wisdom that libertarians would otherwise vote for a Republican, and at least in Arizona, that's really not true. You know, we're not the same ilk, and we don't have the same perspective on commerce and trade and bodily autonomy and family privacy and other things. And, you know, so the idea that our voters would all have gone there if Marc hadn't been in the race, I don't think that's really true.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, it's really hard to say too. I mean, Masters, and that's the one issue. I don't know how the whole, as I call them, immigration warriors. I don't know how that can ever square with. I don't mind. You know, I don't mind having a system where, okay, you've got an arrest record, you can't come in, but the whole, you know, going to an Ellis Island system or something. You know, if you don't like illegal immigrants, we'll make them legal. Make it easier for them to come here legally.
So here's the thing, and actually, I'm glad I get to talk about this a little bit. It's one of the goals I had set out for my term, but a goal we have not achieved. It is possible for states to develop a protocol for their own guest worker program and to essentially seek a congressional rubber stamp for it. Utah did that in 2011. And it turned out that the legislator in Utah who had sponsored it managed to die of a brain tumor before it could be implemented. And eventually it was sort of let go of a few years later. But the federal government and the duopoly parties have a very deeply invested interest in perpetuating the hysteria over immigration and perpetuating the noise. What I had hoped to see AZLP do, and maybe the Libertarian parties in other border states, is to find a private sector alternative around the hysteria. In other words, if we and partners in, say, the Mexican LP or LP business interests or interested persons developed a partnership on both sides of the border to perform some kind of, you know, a vetting and background check process or licensure card and match interested people up with job opportunities on one side of the border or the other. And I'm not articulating it really well, but a private sector guest worker program that worked like a visa program is really the only way that we're going to overcome the noise and the hysteria. You know, Margaret Mead's old saying, if the people lead, eventually the leaders will follow. Utah was leading. Didn't manage to get across the finish line, but was leading. That's the example we should follow. And we should get serious about it. And, whether it's at a level of an Arizona-Sonora partnership, and there are Arizona-Sonora partnerships for other things like wildlife conservation and, cultural heritage sharing and legal service of process and so forth. It's not that, the Hague Convention doesn't allow Arizona and Sonora to collaborate on certain things. It does.
Yes.
It does. Yes, some of these issues are federal issues, but there are ways to get out ahead and to invite essentially a federal rubber stamp of the process. Obviously, not something you and I are going to develop the 1,800 pages of regulations for in a minute conversation. But in other words, that's what needs to be done. The trade agreements that have existed between the US and Mexico are glaring by omission of people. They deal with stuff and not with people.
Yes.
And trade agreements in almost anywhere else in the world, you're also dealing with how you move people around to facilitate the kind of trade that you're talking about.
Yes. Dangerous coral snakes are leaving Mexico and coming into America illegally, and they're biting people.
Well, you know what?
Yeah.
So there's some of that, but so there are.
Well, they are dangerous. Yeah.
There are animals that get tracked by Arizona Fish and Game that go back and forth across the border, and one of them was a bobcat that got shot on the Mexican side of the border. And of course, Fish and Game wants to publicize that. Like bobcat that it gave a name to that travels a few hundred miles a year. So yeah, it's very interesting in Arizona because where the border got drawn in 1912, cut towns in half, like the town of Nogales or city of Nogales,
yes.
it is in La Paz County. Was cut in half by the border. And some years ago, I was down there visiting a friend who is from there originally on Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead. And the hysterical thing about this family is that their ancestors were buried in the church graveyard on the Mexican side. So the way that the Day of the Dead is celebrated is, people take candles and food and photographs and other things to the cemetery and sort of hang out with their ancestors for the day. And so on the Arizona side of the border, all this stuff gets packed into cars, and you drive 2 blocks to the border and have to declare it all and take it all out. And Border Patrol inspects everything, and the sniffer dogs come and they, sniff everything and taste everything and all that, put it back all in the car, drive another 2 blocks down the street to the church on the Mexican side and unpack it all there, and if nothing else, illustrates the absurdity of it all. It's that,
Yes.
that you gotta go to the Border Patrol and let them taste your potato salad and all, all this crazy stuff before you can just go visit your relatives. And
yes. And I know Day of the Dead is huge in Mexico.
And it's huge here in Arizona.
Yeah. Well, interesting. Yes. There was no. So yeah, getting back to that's I don't know. Ron
and I'm
Paul.
a wordy person, so I apologize if I'm digressing.
Yeah, the whole thing about Ron Paul endorsing Blake Masters, I have to say this is one thing that Ron Paul has done that's really puzzled me. I think every once in a while somebody does something that puzzles me, but this is something I'm still trying to figure out what his motivation was. I think now and then, sometimes I think maybe just now and then Ron Paul feels like he needs to say, I'm not the Libertarian Party. And so he needs to do something like that to say he's not the Libertarian Party.
I think we have seen him toe the line for the GOP before when he's been asked to.
Yeah.
And I am assuming it was that kind of a situation.
But I don't know. And the GOP has never been his friend. And I think he's probably doesn't need to. I mean, unless I don't know what his situation is though. And I don't know who Marc Victor's donors were, and I don't know who Ron Paul's donors are either. And I don't even know how much of this is even his doing, or if it's, the doing of his own staff.
Yeah. So you can look at the campaign finance reports that the Victor campaign would have filed. I have not spent significant time with them myself. Yeah. So, but who the donors were will be obtainable information. Yeah.
I know that Mike Termott guy was one of his supporters. So, who's also running for president on the LP's ticket. So,
yeah.
And I know Masters was getting a lot of money from Peter Thiel. I don't really know what, and it sounds like to me Thiel wants to be part of this new high-tech border control system, which is just going to be more police state stuff.
Right. And let me actually throw in another couple of sort of personal and or ad hoc comments about that, which is that this is not a situation where if you think that, you're a citizen and, a law-abiding citizen, that the Border Patrol is going to leave you alone, or that you have no problem with them. That is not the case. Students at Sierra Vista High School, kids were getting frisked routinely by the Border Patrol because the ICE blimp that hovers around in Cochise County was zooming in on them, and the Border Patrol felt like those kids might be suspects or might be somebody they had interest in. I drive a minivan. Once upon a time I drove a minivan because I had a bunch of animals, and I jokingly called it Auntie M's traveling circus. But in recent years, I need the minivan for party events. I need a bunch of tables. I need big tubs of Rubbermaid literature. I need a pop-up tent and a bunch of other things. And, all those things fit in the minivan. And so the thing is my particular brand of minivan, and the Border Patrol knows this, has wells in the floor that the seats fold down into. And, my van is intact with its seats. And when I drive to a convention, I have 8 people in my van and they're all in the seats. But when I'm, out to do an event with the party, the seats are collapsed into the floor and all the stuff is in the van. And the Border Patrol's jurisdiction is supposed to, be a swath of land about 60 or 80 miles around the border. Don't think that they haven't stopped me wanting to inspect the wells in my minivan, in Gila Bend, which is 50 miles south of Phoenix. They'll stop anybody. And if you drive a minivan, they're especially going to stop you. And, so that I'm a citizen and, my Spanish is nowhere near where I'd like it to be, but I'm, a citizen and an English speaking citizen, and I've got ID and the whole 9 yards, as though that's enough to insulate me from, the Border Patrol. It isn't. It isn't. And, so it's not that they're just out there, catching migrants coming across the desert. They're harassing everybody.
Oh, yes. It looks like Marc Victor ran for the House back in 2014.
I don't know if he completed that race or not.
Yeah.
I don't
Well, he
think
has. It looks like he has run for office before.
he has. He
Yeah.
has. Yeah. Not in very recent years, but he has.
Yeah, I looked up some of his what looks like some of his donors here on the webs on the what looks like the FEC. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
nobody really jumps out on here. I see a few donations of 5,000, but there wasn't really one big person, sending all this money. So
Right. And I think that, as compared to the duopoly candidates who had tens of millions each, my understanding is that his total was, a bit over 100,000.
yes,
And I know money talks in politics,
yeah,
I do understand that, but
and the funding was also very lopsided. Kelly versus Masters too. I mean, Masters really did extremely well considering the money that Kelly had versus him. I mean, yeah,
again, I really, I don't know. I mean, yes, money talks. At the same time, there are people who just really feel that sort of border hawk militarization of the border perspective is an attack on them and is an attack on their families. And that is a very, very significant chunk of the population in Arizona.
yeah,
And even if some of those folks liked other elements of what Masters had to offer, coming with that out of the gate would have been a very significant deterrent for them.
yeah,
The other piece in southern Arizona, and without getting into Mark Kelly's policies and this and that, Gobby Giffords was very popular, and being her husband certainly gave him some cachet. And so not with us because they have together pushed very aggressively for very aggressive gun control, which
yes,
Gabby Giffords was opposed to in the years before her injury. But that has made him probably more sympathetic in the minds of certain voters than
yeah,
say his voting record alone would have made him. So
yeah, Gab, yeah, she's kind of become a martyr, yeah, because she got shot for whatever reason. I didn't realize Mark Kelly was her husband, but
yeah,
see that. So yeah, that's certainly
that's
something.
really to a great extent his claim to fame. It's that he's her husband and he was an astronaut.
Yeah, he was an astronaut. Yeah,
It's
astronaut.
those two pieces far more so than policy positions or legislation that he's introduced or supported or
Yeah. Do you think Marc Victor can ever run for office again? At least as a libertarian, or I mean,
oh my goodness, what a question. So I can tell you that there are people within the party who feel like he's virtue signaling that he wants to run in the future as a Republican. I don't know if that's true or not. Would I trust him to carry our flag in a manner with integrity in the future? Personally, I couldn't. Would I want any future chair to encourage our 40,000 voters to trust someone who made it known that his intention was to pull the rug out from under them days before the election? I don't think so. So I don't know what would be different. But this is not the kind of thing when we've been in a decade-long fight for our ballot status and, tooth and nail and lots of lawsuits and 2 petitions for certiorari to the Arizona Supreme Court and lots of hustle, out there in the streets gathering signatures and other things. It's left a really bad taste in people's mouths, and I wouldn't advocate for it, know. And it hurts to say that. It hurts to say that because, he certainly had rock star status among a lot of us, and it makes me sad.
I can just see. That's the thing I see. I can tell there's just this huge letdown. It sounds like not just you. What else would you like to say to the?
Would you like me to read you some of the emails that I got from voters?
I'd love. Yeah, I know you got a lot of emails. I definitely would like you to address some of the things that you got in your emails. You probably can't. I definitely want to hear about this too. Yes.
Yeah, I didn't print them out, but let me pull it up.
Or if there's just, you probably, or some of these emails were probably, echoing the same sentiments. I'd just like to hear, general.
Yeah, are you still seeing me, or did my screen get covered over there?
You're kind of high in the screen, but that's about it.
Okay. All right. So, let me scroll.
Yeah, I guess another question is if Marc Victor was running as a Republican, would you just kind of leave it alone, or would you say, okay, we got to run against Marc Victor?
So our goal, when we are able to, is to run our own candidate for the sake of flying our own flag. Running against. Our first priority, if we're really doing that, is running against incumbents and running in a race where we're only running against one duopoly party.
Yes.
So would we be aggressive in running against him to run against him? I can't say that we would. What I can tell you is that in, I guess, what is about 15 years on the board for me, I am only aware of one instance where we have sued to get a candidate off the ballot. And that candidate was an absolute fraudster who used whiteout to falsify signatures and really had some delusional thinking, you might say. The candidate believed that the government had implanted electrodes in their brain and some other things. And, even in that instance, it was a heavy duty undertaking for us because it would mean not having somebody on the ballot for our candidate, for our voters to vote for, we sort of like, well, this is a person who's a little eccentric and a little this and a little that. And, even under those circumstances, we really heavily weighed it as a board before we made the decision to sue to get that person off the ballot. And we're successful.
Yeah.
But okay, so I released a statement describing that, the party of principle doesn't sell out to the highest bidder, and we don't kowtow to bullies, and among other things. And so one of my voters wrote, "This man, Marc Victor, betrayed the AZLP and the people of Arizona. This political field of candidates is the worst we've ever seen." So that's one guy.
And we should stress, you have no control over these candidates. I mean, and there's nothing you can do if a candidate says, "I quit."
Yeah. Another one said, "Well said. I feel the betrayal." Oh gosh. Someone said, "Thank you for clarifying what happened. As a libertarian, I would never vote for Masters. It's an insult. He's another lying narcissist. It appears Marc Victor was his agent. He's a deceitful person." I mean, those are what our voters think of this.
Something else too, and I forgot to mention this too. The Mises Institute had a supporters summit in Phoenix, I think back in early October.
You're correct.
I wonder if anything was said at that meeting.
Well, and that's where I think the nexus that's, if there is one, that is Masters and Ron Paul and Victor and perhaps people on Masters' campaign staff and on Victor's campaign staff. Yeah. So yes, I have heard that there was elbow rubbing there. At the same time, we have always had people in the party who have been members or donors of Mises Institute, and there has always been elbow rubbing. Yes. And so would we be expecting, this kind of outcome in what we understood and believed was a hard won Senate race, hard won ballot status candidacy or ballot level candidacy. Senate is not a ballot status race for us, but ballot level candidacy. We haven't had, we would sort of regard that as like an attack from within. We haven't had that before.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And and there's always been, a certain significant people in the free market movement who have been very, very good on, who are very, very good on laissez-faire capitalism, but they're not really that good on issues of personal liberty.
The economic issues, yes, and not the regulatory issues, and not the personal autonomy issues, and not the family privacy issues. And sure, and I understand that. I understand that. And think tanks are think tanks. Yeah, I do understand that, and I have heard that hypothesis thrown out there, and I think it's probably a credible one, but I don't have any I don't have any insider information about it. I did not go to that summit myself, so it just popped into my head. I should have remembered that.
You're correct. I've been to a few. I don't think Ron Paul travels very much anymore. They did have an event. They have an event every year near Lake Jackson, Texas, which is near Ron Paul's home, and I think they have it there just because it's easy to get Ron Paul to come to that. Mm-hmm. He did go to Reno, of course, for LP National, but other than that, I don't think he goes and he was at another event in Houston, and the guy said to me, he said, I had this event in Houston just for Ron Paul. So yeah, but I know, but I also know Ron Paul has fairly substantial fees. So that's another thing too.
Sure, of course.
What do you think right now about the overall direction of the Libertarian Party? I mean, you've been around since 2008, so obviously you've seen things happen. Where do you think we're
Actually,
going?
since 05. 8 was really my first.
Okay, 5.
Maybe junior leadership piece or something, but since 5 was the first campaign I worked on, was I think Barry Hess, or 5 into 6, Barry Hess's gubernatorial campaign then.
Yeah, and Barry Hess has been around for a long time, I know.
Right, and he's one of my vice chairs. So yeah, he's on my board. And actually, he did tell, when the board was kind of in post-mortem analysis of the election, and dealing with our own processing of sort of all of this, he did say that he had gotten calls from Republicans he knows asking him to lobby or to try to coerce Marc Victor to drop out, and he had told them no way, no dice. So it may be that they tried to use whoever they had on the inside, and that wasn't effective. I don't know. Barry has a lot of collaborative relationships, coalition building wise and lobbying wise, with Republicans and Democrats, and so that he received those calls and not me does not surprise me. I'm sorry, you were were you asking me about the national direction of the party?
Or Arizona or national. I mean, where do you think we're going right now? Because you've been, we certainly need to do something to, move forward from all this. But obviously, there's been some major changes in the LP. I mean, and we just had, and we've just went through one of the most ridiculous periods in American history. I mean,
I think all that's very true. Is politics ever going to recover from 20 and 2021? All I can say is I hope I see it in my lifetime. I don't know.
I've been around myself, really, I think, well, if I had to think of an event, it was the seminar at the Foundation for Economic Education back in 1994. And that's when I think I've been in the movement ever since. And I was amazed at the amount of people who were either cowards or just traitors in March of 2020. I could not, it was much more than I expected.
I was surprised so I really did feel that the government and the news media were using a lot of, I don't mean to sound hocus pocusy, but essentially psyops. They were using a lot of neurolinguistic programming and other sort of stylized language that was really designed to maximize the fear that, the citizenry were experiencing. And like, I have, some background or training in that. And so I knew what they were doing, and I knew, like, boy, that's extraordinary. And so it seemed not real to me from the very outset. And I personally watch a lot of international news outlets. And so I was, reading Times of India, and I was reading, Al Jazeera, and like, wasn't what the US government was describing. The other piece for me personally was that, our So Phoenix is now, for Arizona, a fairly population dense place, but Arizona as a state is a very not population dense
Oh,
place.
yes.
And where policy was getting driven was in like the most population dense cities on the East Coast. You know, what you needed to do to prevent people from sneezing on each other in the subway in New York City is not at all what you need to do to prevent people from sneezing on each other in
Yes.
rural Arizona, or, you know, even more so rural Montana. And I was having these arguments with people about, you know, and finding statistics, you know, well, the population density in your city is, you know, 2,783 per square mile, and the population density in mine is 483. And so, you know, doesn't it make any kind of sense to you that, you know, the same policies aren't necessary? And I would get this sort of hysteria mongering, you know, lethal virus, global pandemic. There was no proportionalism. You know, anytime that you have risk, and anybody like who works in law or in insurance or something else that, you know, deals with risk and metrics, you look at your pool and what's quantifiable and your incidences. And there was none of that. The whole King's College model was based on like New York and London and not on anything else. And so it was mind-blowing. It was mind-blowing. And I mean, my city, you know, is sort of, so I live in a close inside the freeway suburb of Phoenix. You know, my city has a layout that is probably like suburbs or less populated suburbs in a lot of other places, but the city council still passed a mask when you leave your house, even if you're on your own property ordinance, and a mask violation reporting hotline. And it was actually something that I joked about last winter, and Marc Victor was one of the people in the room who sort of laughed at my joke. But I said, okay, you know, I'm 1,700 to 2,000 feet away from the property of any neighbor. And I go outdoors to feed my tortoises. I'm not wearing a mask because they'll be scared of me and they won't know who I am. And, you know, they see me, they know, like, that's Mama, and Mama's got treats, you know, and they come running up. I'm like, I'm not going to go outdoors, you know, in the open air in this, you know, spacious place when I have a, you know, quarter acre or half acre lot with a mask on to feed my damn tortoises. That is not happening. And the neighbors want to call the cops, let them do it, you know? And like, you know, and it was just mind blowing to me that there were like people who were like, oh my God, I'm going outside my house. I've got to put a mask on because the kid from down the street might be riding by his bicycle and he might breathe some of the same air that I breathe. You know, I like.
And they're tortoises, the animal that lives to over 200. Nothing kills them. You know?
Well, there are things that kill them, but, you know, it wasn't going to be, you know, human respiratory viruses.
Yes.
So, you know, I just.
They're going to outlive you probably. So, yeah.
Anyway, yeah, no, I mean, I'm not meaning to be trite. So, yeah, I think that a lot of people became vulnerable to the psyops. I think that you really had to have some matrix or understanding of language and understanding of government intentions and outcomes to understand that there was some other goal here, you know, that it, and so I won't get into all that, but I think in the West especially, I mean, I will say I saw both the terrible and the valiant in Arizona. I really did. I mean, we saw small, so I did the math at a certain point, because in the first phase of the lockdown, small stores, your independent, like ethnic market, small footprint grocery store, the Indian grocery store, the Turkish grocery store, that had to be closed. But Walmart could be open, and Fry's, the Kroger affiliate, could be open, and the hours were truncated so that you could only go to grocery shop, like 9 in the morning to 6 o'clock at night. So everybody had to be in there at the same time. And so I did the math, the number of parking spaces at my Kroger supermarket, assuming even that each parking, and during the lockdown, those parking spots were always filled, assuming that each car was there for an hour, which was probably minimizing. Chances are each car was maybe there for 20 minutes or a half an hour. But assuming each car was there for an hour, there were, I don't know, 580 something spaces in the parking lot, times the hours a day that the store was open, times 7 days a week. There were 36,000 people a week breathing in that grocery store. And like I don't know if it was the city of Winslow or if it was Navajo County, put in jail this guy in a little souvenir shop who, by his own admission, his souvenir shop got about seven to 10 customers a day. So a place that there are 70 or 80 customers a week, maybe, like, that's too dangerous, and that's got to be closed. But the place that's getting 36,000 customers a week, that's fine.
It just was.
It was mind blowing. It was mind blowing.
How do you think this? I think this was a big. I know that for me, largely because of this, I was all the way behind Angela McArdle for chair. I mean, there was a situation here in Travis County, Texas, Austin, the first week of October of 2020, where an event called the Constitutional Rights Summit, we had paid for a table there, and then our county chair sees that he's the only person there wearing a mask, and says, "Okay, we better get out of this. We better not be a part of this." And I'm like, and after that, I said, and I agreed, if the LP is not going to stand against this, why are we here?
I felt that very strongly, but I can also tell you that even in our own ranks here in Arizona, we had one person on the board who is a cancer survivor who was worried about themselves. Other people who had someone immunocompromised in their households, worried about that. When we got ready to plan our 21 annual meeting, there was an individual on the board who felt like we had to offer something hybrid, and even if we had difficulties managing it technologically, his words were, better to do it and fail than to not have tried. I didn't favor that. I found us an indoor-outdoor venue, and in Arizona in January, even on the worst day, the outdoor temperature's in the 50s, and I found a restaurant that had a outdoor patio that they're willing to put the propane space heaters up, and so we had our regular convention, but we had it in this indoor-outdoor environment. It was very distressing, but I think that there wasn't a real way to determine who was going to be taken in by that advocacy.
Yeah.
And a lot of people were. I was very much not so. But I will also say, well, I believe my household had it in January of 20, and that's another story. And I won't bore you with all the gory details of why. My office was in the same building as a number of tech firms that had been to the Consumer Electronics Show in Vegas, which was like January 6th to 10th of
Yeah.
2020. I got sick like the 14th.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
aside from all that, there was definitely, I think that most of the AZLP was willing to get behind statements about economic waste related to it. For example, during the social distancing periods, the Valley Metro, which is like the consortium of governments that runs buses and the light rail trains, were running buses empty or mostly empty on account of the social distancing requirements. And, so even nurses were not getting to work because a bus that's designed for like 90 people, they were kind of allowing 10 or 12 people on. And so if that bus got to somebody's bus stop and there were already that many people on the bus couldn't pick up the next person. So Valley Metro would then dispatch another bus, but, use the gas and the driver's salary to pick up one person. And, like the amount of waste, what government waste related to enacting these pandemic requirements was just like mind blowing.
Yeah. But I think there was definitely a somewhat, a divide just started after all this came in, though, because I was certainly disappointed with some activists, and while he's not involved with the Libertarian Party, Penn Jillette is one person who's really high on my list of people who disappointed me. And I don't want to mention names, but the person who disappointed me most was a certain medical doctor who lives in Washington, the state of Washington, And there's just part of saying, I want my old friends back, But,
and I hear that. And I did lose friends both in the party and outside the party. And there were people that, I will say in so many words, I had really considered family, like not just friends, but family. And their very separate take on what was happening and whose interests it served and what it meant. There was no coming back from that. I was a person who insisted on working in the office during most of that time. My city, although you can pay the main internet provider for high-speed internet, my neighborhood was actually not wired for it. So some of the database work I needed to do, I actually couldn't do at home.
oh, wow.
So I had told my office manager, look, you don't want me around other people. Okay, let me work graveyard shift. I'll come in at midnight and I'll leave at 8 a.m. And ultimately they didn't want that. And so, they were content to let me work in the office part of the time. I ended up, of all things, catering weddings, which, like, I'm not a caterer, but a few people that I knew lost their wedding venues because of the lockdowns or because, of the gathering restrictions. And I would say, like, your data is, really important. If your data is really important to you, okay, I'll make it happen,
Yeah.
and so I ended up catering a couple of weddings, and, so it was this very interesting sort of, who stands in the gap, and how do you show up for the people who you do care about when.
Yeah. And why, why are you, you claim you want to save lives, but why are you just giving up all the things that make life worth living?
Well, not only that, but
Yeah.
the part that's inexcusable is the the way that people were told. I mean, I don't know if you've listened to Andrew McCullough at all, but
The doctor or
yes.
Andrew McCullough? I thought that was Peter McCullough.
Peter McCullough. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I knew the last name was correct. I apologize for that.
Yeah. I've listened to him. I've listened to a lot of people. I've listened to Simone Gold. I've listened to.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Drew was calling out the paranoia in late February 2020. The famous Dr. Drew. I mean, when I heard him, I just thought, yes, because I also saw, not to the degree, but there was a lot of scaremongering around AIDS back in the 80s.
I said the exact same thing.
And I just
saw government did exactly the same thing, that it wanted to maximize the death rate, maximize the fear, maximize the otherizing, maximize the political disenfranchisement. Oh yeah. No, I remember all of that very, very well. The piece, so here is the thing. I knew that from reading Times of India that the Maharashtra government had sequenced the virus in February or so, had found, at least according to their studies, that it had HIV common sequences, and that they had started treating it with AIDS meds. And I remember having in February of 20, and I remember having a conversation with an acquaintance who was an ER doc, actually had been a schoolmate of one of my siblings, and saying, hey, I read this study out of Maharashtra, and they're using, ritonavir, and they're using turmeric, and she was like, that's ridiculous, all nonsense. And like, really, like 6 months later, remdesivir is the thing. AIDS med. Yeah. Funny how that happens. And so like couldn't, and that it took 8 months to figure out that, maybe prednisone, maybe you use the kind of steroid that you use with asthma or with other kinds of respiratory.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Like that you couldn't like say like, okay, we have a viral infection, let's use antivirals. We have inflammation, let's use anti-inflammatories. We have pneumonia, we often treat pneumonia with diuretics, let's use diuretics. Like all we've got is saline and ventilators, and we need emergency conversion of auto plants to manufacture ventilators, and it's like, what is this? And I'm not going to say that there weren't people who were vulnerable, and that some people didn't die from it or have terrible experiences with it. I know that they did, but government telling people stay home and don't treat it until you can't breathe and then go to the ER was the problem. The healthcare workers who were taking the stuff they knew to take, like, well, gee, I'm taking my vitamin C and I'm taking my vitamin D and I'm taking my Sudafed and I'm taking my NyQuil, and like I worked through it because there was nobody else. That's what they did. I tend to sort of feel like Western medicine is very, very good for diagnostic purposes. I like a lot of Eastern medicine
Yeah.
for therapeutic purposes. When my household had it, we took a lot of medicinal herbs, and I
Yeah.
won't, I'm not a doctor and I'm not giving anyone advice, so I'm not going to get into which ones they were and so forth. But,
Yes.
do something. Don't just stay home until you are too sick to breathe. At
Yes.
that point, it is a lot harder to get you well. Um,
Yeah, and yes, this show is not medical advice, and I'm often one of those guys who doesn't go to the doctor until he feels like he absolutely has to.
right.
And if you have this attitude of I'm going to beat this, when you get sick, you're more likely to beat it than if you have this attitude it's going to kill me. And the body does kind of follow the mind sometimes.
Well, I think some of that's true. I also think it's not just, you know, um,
Yeah,
mobilization of will, I'm going to beat this, but it's also,
yeah,
you know, what's the nature of this and how do I overcome it? And
yeah.
I think that the advocacy of government was designed to prevent people from asking those questions.
I don't know what. Yeah, I have to say too, having worked in server support for hospitals for several years, I generally have more respect for the people who are out on the front lines, working in the ERs, the healthcare workers. And I have a whole lot less respect for anybody who works as a hospital administrator. I mean, they're essentially, most of them are just completely worthless human beings as far as I'm concerned. And they're in these roles where they're making a lot of decisions and doing a whole lot of damage, and they're part of the reason why healthcare is just a total clusterfuck in America.
Well, I think it's bigger than that.
Yeah.
Forgive me. I mean, I think the third party payer pieces
Oh
is
yes.
a big piece, and government's um, approach and participation in that is a piece. And, the lack of transparency in costs is a piece, and the fear of litigation is a piece. And that there, I mean, so in terms of your sense that it's a clusterfuck, yeah, it is. But I don't think that um, if we're dealing with sort of a thing that's got like a dimension of sort of jacks and a ball in the toy sense. I think that the administrators are just one
Oh yeah.
peg of that jack. It's
Yeah.
they're not. It's not the whole creature. So my
Yeah.
humble
Uh,
sentiment,
yeah.
Housework, but
We didn't mention the name of the people that you consider family, but I think I know who you're talking about. It with what do and some of those other people also are very much against the Mises Caucus. What do you think the people who hate the Mises Caucus really want?
oh, what an interesting question. So let me give you my perspective, and um, I'm a weirdo in this perspective, but and I imagine you're of a similar age cohort
I'm
to me.
51.
So
And I've
I
noticed,
am older than you.
yeah, but that's one thing I've noticed. It seemed like a lot of time I was always the young guy, and now that the Mises Caucus is in there, I'm the old guy suddenly.
Right. So okay. So if you've read, material from the 60s and,
Hmm.
the sentiments in the anti-war movement in the 60s and the
Yes.
way that, the older generation was always the man. And um, I personally, and I have wanted to do this. We have just actually started to roll out an AZLP podcast, and I've wanted to do a couple of either panels or series on this. But my personal belief is that some of that founding generation, so there are two things. I think there is like a set of real issues and a set of non-real issues. The what might be a real issue are the founders' generation's involvement in the objectivist movement and their both lens of Randian principles and the language they use around that. And I think that that's a real thing for them. And a lot of the younger folks coming in don't share that experience or cultural background and don't speak that language. And so they find those younger folks as foreign. I feel, so the issue of whether you think there need to be more Randians or more objectivists in the party or not, I'll leave that as a side issue for now. You know, myself personally, I don't favor any religious litmus test in the party, whatever religious conviction it happens to be. But I think there's a generational language gap. I don't think that, you know, my youngest officers are 19 and I have two of them. They're both at the county level. One's a county chair, one's a county vice chair. My oldest voting Libertarian is 101. And I don't think that what those guys, and I know them all personally, want is so radically different. But I think the way that they talk about it is what's different. And I think that a lot of the younger folk who have come into the party with Mises have a generational and cultural language that characterizes certain pieces of what we stand for in a different linguistic way than the founder generation spoke.
Yeah.
I don't think it's conceptually at odds, you know. And so part of what I want to do is sort of grab a few representative people of each generational cohort and put everybody in a room and, you know, get them all to talk about how they would talk about these things. See if we can identify the elephant in the room, which I think is the generational piece more so than it is, you know, a deep ideological divide. That's at least my perspective. I think that there are people who are more comfortable in an environment that is linguistically and culturally familiar.
Yeah.
And for some of the older folks, the environment is no longer linguistically and culturally familiar. And
I do wonder if that's part of the difference. I mean, I myself am very, you know, I call this the Fountainhead Forum, so you can see where that comes from.
No, I understand.
And you know, I don't know if you know, regarding the pandemic, have you seen some of the spew that's come out of the Ayn Rand Institute in the last 2.5 years? I told somebody I'm completely disgusted with ARI because they seem to think there seemed to be a tacit acceptance of all of it, but
they got all up in their science is reason and what the government representatives say is science.
Yeah.
And you know, whether that's really science or not.
Yes. And I've noticed, but I think the liberty movement has to have a lot of different gurus, but I also think the fact that Ayn Rand has become so distant from the liberty movement is a real tragedy for both movements. if there ever could have been an alliance of Rand and Rothbard, I would love to see what that would have worked out. I think it would have been amazing, but it never happened. And now here we are. But
we're sort of a strange and quirky big tent. And I think we always have been, I mean, even in some of the earlier years when it was, Randians and Yippies, I mean, and we're, a big tent now with, drug activists and veterans and, polyamorists and Christian homeschoolers. And we have navigated some of those less well-worn cultural paths actually fairly well.
Yeah.
When you consider that we've been around for 50 years and we've managed to agree on what we can agree on. And, it's sort of a really sad thing that as well as we've done that the thing that we have let separate us from our colleagues and comrades in arms has been how much you believe the government,
Yeah, I wonder.
That's the really scary thing. It's a whole other thing if, somebody's a Randian atheist and somebody else is an evangelical Christian and they can't agree on whatever because the scripts of their lives run on such different parameters. But this wasn't what that was. This was I buy what the government says and you don't, or I don't buy what the government says and you do. How did we ever let that get in the middle of us?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I do. And that was one thing I asked myself is that when did libertarians suddenly start trusting the news media about what they say about the news? It's, you never trusted them on the wars. And now you're trusting them on this. It was rather odd. But I've also noticed too, though, since, as I pointed out, I was, I was in my 20s in the 90s. It didn't seem like anybody was capturing my age bracket at all. And my age bracket just kind of got left out because I don't see that many people in my age bracket. They're
okay. I'm going to have to say it now. This is a funny joke. Okay. And, please, maybe I shouldn't. I have this rap that I do about being transgenerational because I get told that I look younger than I am. And I have been very, trans supportive. And so it's not meant as a slam to any trans people.
Yeah.
But, I was involved in the anti-war issues and the Native issues in the 80s and the 90s, which I was very young for in those years. And, who I do the most with politically these days are millennials. And, the first person I said this to was a millennial. She was like, "Oh, you mean you were like assigned Gen X at birth, but you identified as a baby boomer before and you're a millennial now?" And I said, "Yeah, something like that." And she's like, "Oh, absolutely. You sound exactly like a millennial." And I was like, "Oh, really? Isn't that interesting?" So, to the extent that we don't, as libertarians, we don't buy a lot of boxes that other people put us into. Why do we have to buy generational cohort boxes either? I'll be whatever generation I want, come fight with me about it, And so anyway.
Yeah, I don't know where my generation is. I think it's because when I was born, my parents were 36 and 39, and I had brothers who were 17, 12, and 11. So I've always been
So
in
my,
groups where I'm the
so
only person my age. You have to
my
start
dad
using
was 40 when I was born, and so I
yeah.
had older parents as well. And I think, probably that's part of the reason I identified as older for so long.
Oh yeah.
Um, I think, I don't know. It's
Yeah.
whatever it is,
Well,
whatever.
yeah. So,
But
well, it's where do you think the LP? What do you think is going to happen in 2024? Do you have anybody you'd like to see be our presidential candidate in 2024, or can you say that?
um, I don't have a preferred candidate yet, and I'll be interested to see. I'll be interested to see what happens.
Yeah.
I will say, well, I guess I could say this. I will say that I supported Adam Kokesh in 20,
Oh.
and I would not be unhappy if he ran again.
Oh wow.
But again, he's one of our hometown team in Arizona, and so I'm probably not surprising anybody when I say that.
Yeah.
And other than that, no, I don't have a
Yeah.
perspective.
Yeah. I should ask you. Do you ever go to the Jackalope Festival or hang out with any of the Arizona anarchists like Larkin Rose or?
Larkin Rose is not an Arizona anarchist.
Oh, he's
He's
not.
in Pennsylvania, I think.
Oh. I think he was in Arizona. I guess.
He definitely has friends here. And he
Yeah.
has,
Well, I know Alma
that's
Summer
been,
and Jackalope and people like that
that's
go.
been out here. Yeah, no, I have not
Yeah.
gone to Jackalope. I do know many people who do.
Yeah. I mean.
I am
Yeah.
not that much of a festival person.
Yeah,
I'm sure that,
Jackalope's really, I guess you'd call it Pork Fest West too, or at least it's
to
kind of
some
that
extent.
spirit. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this has been a great talk, and I don't know if you have anything else you want to say before we
No,
go.
I know we've gotten kind of far afield. I don't know if I answered, all of the questions.
No, I think we covered everything that needed covered with the Marc Victor
Okay.
stuff. I'm glad you got a chance to get your message out there, but I really just let these conversations go and let them flow and
Yeah,
talk
no, I
about
appreciate it.
what you're talking
I
about.
have not done a lot of media, in part. I have really felt that, it's not me or, what I have to say that's that important. It's the party and it's the message. But, I think especially in the aftermath of this election, um, those of us who are in leadership speak for the party, and so for the party to speak, we have to be visible, and so I appreciate the opportunity.
Yes, I appreciate you, and because it certainly sounds like you're very busy and have a lot of irons in the fire. So so yes, I'm glad you could take time, and this. I think it puts a more human face on it. And people will say,
Um,
no, it's not Emily Goldberg's fault that Marc Victor dropped out. It's Marc Victor's fault.
well, I hope so, and I think that um, if there's any takeaway that I would want to leave with people, it would just be that, sure, a candidate can make decisions themselves or their family and, what's best for their life. And I get it. But especially when we've had the ballot status struggle we've had and the struggle we've had to get candidates on the ballot, and 40,000 people want to vote for somebody who's got that LBT next to their name, and another 30,000 want to vote for somebody who doesn't have REP or DEM next to their name. At that point, it isn't just what is best for the candidate anymore.
Yeah.
It's those tens of thousands of voters that have really invested their trust and, you know, their integrity and their voting franchise and all of that in you. And I will certainly encourage my successor in January to emphasize that, you know, any candidates in the future really have to embrace that. You know, they have to embrace it like it matters, like it's what we're here to do, because it is what we're here to do. You know, the educating people and the rubbing elbows and the, you know, having pints and porcupines meetups over, you know, nachos and beer and all of that stuff's important too. But at the end of the day, where the rubber meets the road is LBT next to someone's name on the ballot, and what can my 40,000 voters do about it? And it ripped my heart out. It really did. And, you know, and like, and I'm not a gushy person, you know, and so anyway.
Most of us in the LP aren't that gushy. I don't think.
Yeah, that's right. You know, we're a bunch of tough.
I can see the letdown, and I think that's the hard part is after you've let people down, you'll never trust them again. But
that's right.
But you know,
and the thing is that we're within, you know, there are two metrics that control our ballot status. One is our registrations, and the other is performance in the gubernatorial and presidential elections. And we are hanging on by, you know, a few thousand people, and a few thousand of that 40 losing faith in us. That could be the final nail in the coffin. You know, I don't want to see that. You know, does he want to see that? Does he want to see that? Did he want them to not believe that we were the vanguard of all of their freedoms all the time anymore?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I don't know. It's you know, and I really want to stress that Marc Victor has fought a lot of good fights over the years. It's this, you know, it really, that's why I think why it's somewhat surprising, but, and, you know, I don't know, maybe, and, you know, maybe Blake Masters will get elected to the Senate and end up being a great senator. I don't know, but
I think so. The race has been called for Kelly.
Yeah, but maybe sometime down in the future, though. No, I know not this one, but, you know.
Yeah, no, the vote has not been certified yet, and I'm expecting that, you know, the GOP is going to file a lot of lawsuits, and there are a couple of races that have gone to mandatory recount because their percentages are too close. And
and I know Carrie Lake's really wanting to fight too, but she for the governor's house, you know.
Yeah, well, so I think that some of the last minute voters who I think would likely have been her voters, I think she turned off with her comments. It was 4 days, maybe 5 days before the election. She was describing that essentially that she was going to squelch the First Amendment, that her administration was going to regulate the media. They were going to prevent her from she was going to prevent them from asking certain kind of questions. And, you know, there wasn't going to be this anymore. And I was just like, oh my God, you know, she just like really openly and without shame attacked the First Amendment and said she was going to pull the plug on it. And, you know, Arizonans are a little smarter than that, you know.
That was another thing about Blake Masters is he doesn't like Section 230, and I'm really, really worried about what will happen if the red team starts to tamper with social media and stuff like that. I think it's going. There's a 90% chance that what they do is going to be bad.
Yeah.
and make the
Well,
problem worse, and under the guise of fixing, under the claim of trying to fix it.
right. And, you know, I think there is a freedom streak that runs through Arizona that, you know, we sort of mythically or mythologically say that it's, you know, that it's written on our landscape, and that, you know, you saw it in Cochise and in Geronimo and in Barry Goldwater. And, you know, we sort of say these things lyrically, but Arizonans really do have, you know, a reflective, independent, don't tell us what to do, kind of moral compass. And they don't want their First Amendment rights abridged either. Even if they have some mistrust or
Yeah.
doubt about the integrity of the election system,
Yeah.
they know intuitively that the answer to that is more transparency, not squelching the First Amendment. You know?
Yeah.
And so I don't know. You know, I guess you asked me earlier if the duopoly is making it harder. You know, like we had that saying, you know, a few years back in the LP, the statists are going to state. Well, the duopoly is going to duopoly, you know, and it's going to keep doing it. And, you know, it is what they do. So.
Yeah, well, that's true. So I guess we can wrap up now. And this has been the first edition of the Fountainhead Forum to go over 2 hours, and it's been a good 2 hours.
Oh my God. Well, I'm a wordy person, so, you know, edit it or cut it down any old way that.
I don't edit. I've only edited things for either that really just didn't belong in there. I don't edit much. I'm just going to leave it as is, and hopefully it'll be clean. I can listen to it once and be done.
Okay.
So who knows? But thank you very much. It's been great talking to you. I'm Chris Baker. You can go to my website at chrisbaker.net or get my novel Escape from the Village. This is the 11th edition of the Fountainhead Forum, and we are closing out. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good night. Bye.